In the winter of 1697, 17 bodies were discovered buried beneath the floorboards of a modest wooden house in Salem Village, Massachusetts. Each corpse bore identical marks. Precise cuts along the throat made with surgical instruments, hands bound with hemp rope in intricate knots that suggested ritualistic purpose, and strange symbols carved into their foreheads, with what appeared to be a medical blade sharpened to razor precision. The wounds showed a level of anatomical knowledge that chilled even the most experienced colonial physicians who examined them. The colonial authorities sealed the records immediately, confiscating every document and piece of evidence before the sun had set on that horrific February day. For over 3 centuries, the name Prudence Fairweather was deliberately erased from every official document, court record, and historical account. What they found in that house challenged everything the Puritan community believed about evil, faith, and the darkness that could lurk behind the most pious facade. The discovery would haunt the Massachusetts Bay Colony for generations, whispered about in hushed tones before being buried beneath layers of official silence and collective amnesia. Before we continue with the story of Prudence Fairweather and the 17 souls she claimed in the name of divine purification, let me know in the comments what state you're listening from, and if you're ready to hear a tale that will make you question everything you thought you knew about colonial America. Don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this one are exactly why our channel exists. The transition from this horrific discovery to understanding how such evil could flourish undetected would require examining the very fabric of Puritan society itself. The small community of Salem Village in 1697 existed in a state of perpetual tension that made it the perfect hunting ground for a predator like Prudence Fairweather. Located roughly 8 miles inland from the bustling port of Salem town, the village was home to approximately 600 souls who lived under the constant weight of religious scrutiny, economic hardship, and the lingering trauma of the witch trial hysteria that had claimed 25 lives just 5 years earlier. The physical landscape of Salem Village reflected the harsh realities of colonial life in New England. Dense forests of oak, pine, and maple pressed against the settlement from all sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even midday felt shrouded in perpetual twilight. The wilderness harbored genuine dangers: wolves, bears, and hostile Native American tribes who viewed the expanding colonial presence as an existential threat to their way of life. These external threats created a fortress mentality among the villagers, making them suspicious of outsiders while simultaneously desperate for anyone who could contribute to their survival. The village itself consisted of roughly 45 wooden structures arranged around a central common area dominated by the stark, imposing meeting house where Reverend Samuel Parris delivered his fire and brimstone sermons twice each Sunday. The houses were built from rough-hewn logs and boards, their steep-pitched roofs designed to shed the heavy snows that could isolate the community for months during the brutal New England winters. Smoke rose constantly from stone chimneys, carrying with it the mingled scents of burning wood, cooking food, and the ever-present prayers of a community desperately seeking redemption for sins both real and imagined. The social hierarchy of Salem Village was rigidly defined by Puritan theology and economic necessity. At the top sat the established farming families like the Putnams and Coreys, whose substantial land holdings provided them with both wealth and political influence. Below them were the skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, millers, and weavers, whose specialized knowledge made them valuable to the community's survival. At the bottom of the social structure were the laborers, widows, unmarried women, and recent arrivals who survived on the charity and goodwill of their more established neighbors. Into this carefully ordered but fundamentally unstable society came Prudence Fairweather in the autumn of 1692, arriving just as the witch trial hysteria began its slow, agonizing conclusion. She appeared as a widow of 32 years, traveling alone except for a single wagon containing her modest possessions and an impressive collection of medical instruments that immediately marked her as someone of unusual education and capability. Her story, delivered with convincing detail to anyone who asked, was that her husband, Jeremiah, had died of fever during their journey from Providence Plantation in Rhode Island. She carried with her what appeared to be legitimate documents, a marriage certificate, a death certificate signed by a physician, and letters of recommendation from religious leaders attesting to her character and medical skills. These papers, though later investigation would prove them to be masterful forgeries, provided her with the credibility she needed to establish herself in the community. Prudence's physical appearance perfectly suited her chosen role as a devout Puritan healer. She stood slightly above average height for women of the period, with a slender but strong build that suggested both gentility and the physical capability necessary for medical work. Her most striking feature was her eyes, pale blue, almost colorless in certain light, with an intensity that many villagers found both comforting and slightly unsettling. Her hair, prematurely gray despite her relatively young age, was always kept meticulously arranged beneath a spotless white cap that never seemed to show stains despite her claimed medical work. Her hands drew particular attention from those she treated. They were unusually steady, with long, slender fingers that moved with surgical precision, whether she was preparing herbal remedies, assisting at births, or simply handling everyday objects. Several villagers commented on how gentle her touch was when examining patients, though a few mentioned an odd coldness to her skin that seemed unrelated to the weather or her general health. The villagers welcomed Prudence cautiously but gratefully, as medical knowledge was desperately scarce in the frontier settlements. Most births were attended by elderly women whose knowledge came from experience rather than training, and serious injuries or illnesses often resulted in death simply because no one possessed the skills to provide effective treatment. Prudence's claimed expertise in treating everything from difficult births to infected wounds, combined with her extensive knowledge of herbal medicine, made her seem like an answer to their prayers. She rented a small but well-built house on the outskirts of the village from Ezekiel Hathorne, a distant cousin of Judge John Hathorne, who had presided over many of the witch trials. The house sat isolated among a grove of ancient elm trees whose bare branches in winter created a natural screen that provided privacy for whatever activities took place within. The structure consisted of a single large room with a sleeping loft accessed by a steep wooden ladder, and Prudence quickly set about dividing the space with hanging blankets to create separate areas for cooking, sleeping, and what she described as her medical practice. She furnished the house modestly but efficiently, purchasing items from other settlers and occasionally from traveling merchants who passed through the village. Her most notable possessions were her medical instruments, an extensive collection of knives, saws, forceps, and other tools that she claimed were essential for surgical procedures. These instruments were kept in a specially constructed wooden case lined with velvet, and Prudence maintained them with obsessive care, spending hours each week cleaning and sharpening them to surgical perfection. During her first months in Salem Village, Prudence devoted considerable effort to establishing herself as a devout Puritan whose religious knowledge rivaled that of formerly trained ministers. She never missed Sunday services, arriving early and staying late to discuss theological matters with Reverend Parris and other community leaders. Her knowledge of Scripture was genuinely impressive. She could recite entire chapters from memory and possessed an encyclopedic understanding of Puritan doctrine that she had clearly studied extensively before her arrival. More importantly, she demonstrated an intuitive understanding of the psychological and spiritual needs of a community still reeling from the witch trial trauma. She spoke eloquently about the dangers of false accusations, the importance of forgiveness, and the need for healing in the aftermath of tragedy. Her words seemed to offer exactly the kind of spiritual guidance the villagers desperately needed, positioning her as a voice of reason and compassion in a community torn apart by suspicion and guilt. The first disappearance occurred on February 14, 1693, during one of the harshest winter storms in living memory. Margaret Keniston, a 45-year-old widow known throughout Salem Village for her punctuality and unwavering religious devotion, failed to return from evening prayers at the meeting house. Margaret had lost her husband Robert to a wolf attack the previous summer, and had since thrown herself into religious activities with an intensity that concerned even her closest friends. The circumstances of Margaret's disappearance were particularly troubling because of her predictable routines and cautious nature. She lived alone in a small cottage near the village center and followed the same schedule every day: morning prayers at home, afternoon work in her garden or with her spinning wheel, and evening services at the meeting house. She was known for leaving the meeting house promptly after services ended, walking directly home along the well-traveled path that connected the religious center to the residential areas. When Margaret failed to appear for morning prayers the following day, her neighbor Elizabeth Proctor became concerned enough to check on her welfare. She found Margaret's cottage cold and empty, with no signs that anyone had been there since the previous afternoon. The fire in the hearth had burned down to cold ashes. Margaret's evening meal sat untouched on the table, and her bed showed no evidence of being slept in. The search for Margaret began immediately, led by some of the village's most experienced woodsmen. They followed her usual route from the meeting house to her cottage, looking for any signs of what might have happened to her. The heavy snow that had fallen during the night made tracking difficult, but they found evidence that someone had indeed walked along the path the previous evening. However, the tracks seemed to end abruptly near a grove of pine trees roughly halfway between the meeting house and Margaret's home. Most puzzling was the discovery of Margaret's prayer book lying open in the snow beneath one of the pine trees. The book was positioned carefully, as if someone had placed it there deliberately rather than dropping it accidentally. The pages were open to Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd," and despite being exposed to the storm all night, the book showed remarkably little damage from the wind and snow. Prudence Fairweather was among the most vocal and dedicated participants in the search for Margaret. She spent hours walking through the frozen forest, calling Margaret's name with such genuine desperation that many villagers commented on her Christian charity and compassion. She organized prayer vigils, prepared hot soup for the search parties, and offered to examine any evidence that might provide clues about Margaret's fate. "Sister Margaret is surely in God's hands now," Prudence would say to anyone who would listen, her voice breaking with what appeared to be sincere emotion. "We must pray that her soul finds peace, whether in this world or the next." Sometimes the Lord calls his most faithful servants home in ways that seem mysterious to our mortal understanding. Her theological interpretation of Margaret's disappearance resonated with many villagers who were struggling to make sense of the tragedy. The concept that God might have called Margaret to some higher purpose provided a framework for understanding her vanishing that didn't require them to confront the possibility of more earthly dangers lurking in their community. 3 weeks after Margaret's disappearance, on March 8, 1693, Thomas Bridgman vanished under similarly mysterious circumstances. Thomas was a skilled carpenter of 22 years who had been working to repair storm damage at a farm in the nearby hamlet of Topsfield. He was known for his reliability and had established a routine of traveling to Topsfield early in the morning and returning to Salem village before sunset to avoid traveling the forest paths in darkness. On the day of his disappearance, Thomas had completed his work earlier than expected and began his journey home in mid-afternoon, giving him plenty of daylight for the 3-mile walk through the forest. When he failed to arrive home by sunset, his mother Sarah became worried enough to alert the village constables. A search party departed immediately, following the well-known path between Salem village and Topsfield. They found Thomas's tools scattered along the forest path, approximately 1 mile from Salem village, but there were no signs of struggle or violence. His carpenter's bag had been opened, and its contents spread across a wide area, as if someone had been searching through his possessions. Most of his tools were present, but several of the smaller, more valuable items, including a set of precision chisels his father had given him, were missing. More disturbing than the scattered tools was the discovery of Thomas's coat hanging from a tree branch roughly 20 feet from the path. The coat showed no signs of damage or violence, and it was positioned in a way that suggested someone had placed it there carefully, rather than it being torn away during a struggle. Inside one of the coat pockets, searchers found a hastily written note in Thomas's handwriting. "Going to help someone in need. Don't worry." The note raised more questions than it answered. Thomas's family insisted that he would never have abandoned his valuable tools to help a stranger, and the vague language was unlike his usual direct communication style. Moreover, no one in the area had reported needing assistance, and there were no other travelers on the forest path that day who might have requested Thomas's help. Once again, Prudence Fairweather emerged as one of the most dedicated participants in the search efforts. She comforted Thomas's grieving mother with remarkable skill, sitting with her through long nights of prayer and preparing special herbal teas that seemed to ease Sarah's emotional distress. She also organized a systematic search of the forest that impressed the village constables with its thoroughness and strategic thinking. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Prudence would whisper while holding Sarah's trembling hands. Perhaps Thomas was called to serve a higher purpose that we cannot yet understand. We must trust in divine providence and pray that he is safe in God's care. Her ability to provide spiritual comfort during such a traumatic time further cemented her reputation as an exceptionally devout and compassionate member of the community. Many villagers began to see her as their unofficial spiritual counselor, someone who could help them navigate the theological implications of tragedy and loss. By the summer of 1693, 5 more villagers had disappeared under similarly mysterious circumstances, each vanishing following the same disturbing pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Rebecca Noyes, a young mother of 3 children, disappeared while walking to visit her sister in a neighboring settlement. Her body was never found, but her silver locket, a family heirloom she never removed, was discovered hanging from a tree branch miles from her intended route. Samuel Noyes, Rebecca's elderly father-in-law and a respected elder in the church, vanished while checking on his livestock during a summer evening. His family found the barn doors open and several animals missing, but there were no signs of theft or violence. Samuel's walking stick was found in the forest, carved with strange symbols that no one in the village could identify or explain. Jonathan Prescott, the village blacksmith whose skills were essential to the community's survival, disappeared while traveling to Salem town to purchase iron and other supplies for his forge. His horse returned to the village riderless, carrying a message supposedly written by Jonathan, stating that he had decided to seek his fortune in Boston and would not be returning. The handwriting appeared to be his, but the language and phrasing were completely unlike his usual direct manner of speaking. Mary Corey, a skilled seamstress known throughout the region for her beautiful embroidery work, vanished while gathering berries in the forest behind her family's farm. Her berry basket was found empty, positioned carefully on a fallen log, as if someone had placed it there as a marker. Nearby, searchers discovered several pieces of her embroidery work hanging from tree branches, creating an eerie display that seemed to have been arranged deliberately. Elizabeth Ward, a girl of merely 16 who helped her family operate a small grist mill, disappeared while delivering flour to a customer in a neighboring village. Her horse and cart were found abandoned at a crossroads, with the flour bags neatly stacked beside the path. A note pinned to one of the bags claimed that Elizabeth had decided to join a religious community in Connecticut, but her family insisted she had never expressed any such desire and was too young to make such a decision independently. Each disappearance followed the same disturbing pattern that the remaining villagers were beginning to recognize with growing unease. The missing individuals would vanish while traveling alone or working in isolated areas, leaving behind carefully arranged personal belongings and often a note that seemed inconsistent with their known personality or desires. The notes all shared similar themes about serving God or seeking spiritual fulfillment, but the language was formal and theological, in ways that seemed foreign to the missing person's usual manner of expression. The villagers' initial theories about wolves, bears, or Indian attacks began to seem increasingly inadequate as explanations for the systematic nature of the disappearances. Wild animals didn't arrange personal belongings or forge notes, and hostile tribes typically left clear evidence of their presence rather than conducting subtle kidnappings that left no traces of violence. Reverend Samuel Parris, whose own daughter had been central to the witch trial hysteria 5 years earlier, began incorporating increasingly dark themes into his Sunday sermons. He spoke of Satan walking among them in human form, using the community's faith and charity against them with diabolical cunning. His words resonated with a community already traumatized by the witch trials, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that made rational investigation increasingly difficult. Evil does not always announce itself with thunder and brimstone. Paris thundered from his pulpit, his eyes scanning the assembled congregation with the same intensity he had shown during the witch trial period. Sometimes it comes disguised as righteousness, whispering prayers while concealing the blackest of intentions. We must be vigilant against such deceptions, lest we fall victim to the same spiritual blindness that has claimed our missing brothers and sisters. During this period of growing terror and suspicion, Prudence Fairweather's reputation as a healer and devout Christian continued to flourish. She seemed to anticipate the community's needs with uncanny precision, always arriving at the scene of tragedy with exactly the right combination of spiritual guidance and practical assistance. Her medical skills proved increasingly valuable as stress and fear began taking their toll on the village's physical and mental health. She established what she called a prayer circle for the families of the missing, organizing twice-weekly meetings in her isolated house where grieving relatives could find comfort and spiritual support. These gatherings became central to the community's efforts to cope with the ongoing crisis, and Prudence's role as their leader further cemented her position as an indispensable member of Salem Village society. It was during one of these prayer meetings in late August that Martha Corey, the sister of the missing seamstress Mary, first noticed something that would eventually lead to the exposure of Prudence's true nature. As the group knelt in prayer around Prudence's main room, Martha's attention was drawn to dark stains on the wooden floorboards near the back wall of the house. The stains appeared fresh despite the dry summer weather, and their pattern suggested that liquid had been spilled repeatedly in the same area. When Martha mentioned her observation to Prudence after the meeting ended, the healer's reaction was swift but subtle. Her pale blue eyes seemed to flash with momentary intensity before she explained that the stains resulted from her medical practice. Blood from treating wounds, assisting in difficult births, and preparing herbal remedies that sometimes required her to work with animal organs and other organic materials. "The work of healing is not always clean, Sister Martha," Prudence said, her voice maintaining its usual gentle tone despite the cold calculation that Martha thought she glimpsed in her expression. "The Lord's mercy sometimes requires us to witness suffering and death before we can deliver salvation. I have seen things in my medical practice that would disturb those without the spiritual strength to understand God's greater purposes." Her explanation was plausible enough to satisfy most listeners, but Martha found herself increasingly troubled by inconsistencies in Prudence's story and behavior that she hadn't noticed before. The woman who claimed to spend her nights delivering babies and treating injuries somehow always appeared fresh and well-rested in the morning. Her medical supplies never seemed to diminish despite her claimed extensive practice, and she possessed financial resources that seemed inconsistent with someone who worked primarily for charitable contributions. As autumn painted the Massachusetts wilderness in shades of crimson and gold that reminded the villagers uncomfortably of blood, the pattern of disappearances began to reveal itself to those brave enough to examine the evidence with methodical precision. Martha Corey, driven by growing suspicions about her sister Mary's fate and haunted by the memory of those dark stains in Prudence's house, started documenting every detail of each vanishing with the careful attention of a natural investigator. Working in secret to avoid arousing suspicion, Martha interviewed the families of each missing person, asking detailed questions about their loved ones' final days and any interactions they might have had with other villagers. What emerged from these conversations was a pattern so clear and disturbing that Martha initially questioned her own reasoning, wondering if grief and fear were causing her to see connections that didn't actually exist. Every missing villager shared certain characteristics that couldn't be dismissed as mere coincidence once they were viewed together. Each had been known within the community for what Puritan society considered moral failings or spiritual weaknesses that marked them as potential targets for divine judgment. More troubling still, each had been seen meeting privately with Prudence Fairweather in the days or weeks before their disappearance. Margaret Keniston had been observed speaking too familiarly with a traveling merchant, behavior that some villagers interpreted as inappropriate for a recent widow. She had also been struggling with doubts about God's justice following her husband's violent death, questions that she had shared with several community members, including Prudence, during what was described as spiritual counseling sessions. Thomas Bridgman had been caught drinking rum behind the meeting house after a Sunday service, a serious violation of Puritan moral codes that had resulted in public censure from the church leadership. He had also been known to work on the Sabbath, when customers offered particularly good payment for urgent carpentry jobs, another practice that marked him as spiritually unreliable. Rebecca Noyes had given birth to her first child less than 9 months after her wedding, leading to whispered speculation about premarital relations that had never been directly addressed, but had damaged her reputation within the community. She had sought Prudence's counsel about dealing with gossip and social ostracism that was affecting her family's standing in the village. Samuel Noyes had been suspected of cheating his neighbors in grain sales, using false weights and measures to increase his profits during times of scarcity. Several farmers had complained about his practices, though no formal charges had ever been brought. He had approached Prudence for guidance about making amends for past business dealings that were troubling his conscience. Jonathan Prescott had been known to work on the Sabbath despite repeated warnings from church leaders, claiming that his ironworking skills were too essential to the community's survival to be restricted by religious observances. He had also been suspected of overcharging for his services during emergencies, taking advantage of others' desperation for his unique skills. Mary Corey had been accused of vanity for her elaborate embroidery work, which some villagers considered inappropriate displays of pride and worldly focus. She had been struggling with these accusations and had sought Prudence's advice about whether her artistic abilities were sinful or could be used to serve God's purposes. Elizabeth Ward had been seen walking unchaperoned with a young man from Topsfield, behavior that violated strict Puritan codes about interaction between unmarried individuals. The relationship had been discovered by her parents, who had forbidden further contact and arranged for her to meet with Prudence for guidance about proper Christian conduct for unmarried women. The pattern was unmistakable once Martha laid out all the evidence systematically. Each missing person had committed acts or harbored thoughts that marked them as spiritually compromised according to strict Puritan standards. More significantly, each had turned to Prudence Fairweather for spiritual counseling and guidance about their moral failings, seeking the kind of religious absolution that only a minister would normally be qualified to provide. Martha shared her disturbing discoveries with her husband Giles, a man whose own experiences during the witch trial period had made him acutely sensitive to the dangers of false accusations and mass hysteria. Giles had been pressed to death with heavy stones in 1692 after refusing to confess to witchcraft charges, an experience that had left him physically and emotionally scarred, but also deeply skeptical of supernatural explanations for human behavior. Initially, Giles was reluctant to accept Martha's theories about Prudence's involvement in the disappearances. His traumatic experiences during the witch trials had taught him how easily suspicion could spiral into deadly accusations based on circumstantial evidence and community fears. He understood better than most how innocent people could be destroyed by neighbors who allowed fear and superstition to override rational judgment. However, as Martha continued gathering evidence and documenting the connections between Prudence and each missing person, even Giles was forced to acknowledge that the pattern suggested human agency rather than supernatural intervention. The systematic nature of the disappearances, combined with the careful staging of evidence and the forged notes, pointed to someone with intelligence, planning ability, and detailed knowledge of each victim's personal struggles and daily routines. They began expanding their investigation carefully, reaching out to other community members who might have noticed inconsistencies in Prudence's behavior or story. They found unexpected allies in Sarah Bridgman, the mother of the missing carpenter Thomas, who had overcome her initial gratitude to Prudence and begun questioning the healer's true motives and capabilities. Sarah had been troubled by several aspects of her interactions with Prudence that seemed inconsistent with genuine medical training or spiritual guidance. Despite claiming extensive experience with difficult births and surgical procedures, Prudence had made several comments about anatomy and medical techniques that suggested her knowledge came from books rather than practical experience. She had also shown unusual interest in Thomas's personal habits, daily routines, and family relationships that seemed to go beyond normal pastoral concern. More disturbing, Sarah had noticed that Prudence seemed to possess detailed information about Thomas's final day that she claimed to have received through prayer and spiritual intuition. She knew that he had completed his carpentry work early, that he had been in an unusually good mood during his final morning, and that he had mentioned plans to purchase new tools when he next visited Salem town. This information had never been shared with anyone outside the immediate family, making Prudence's knowledge of it deeply suspicious. The secret investigators also discovered financial irregularities surrounding the disappearances that raised additional questions about Prudence's true circumstances and motives. Each missing person had possessed small amounts of money, jewelry, or valuable items that were never found after their vanishing. Thomas had carried a purse containing payment for his carpentry work. Rebecca wore valuable silver jewelry inherited from her grandmother, and Jonathan was known to keep a substantial amount of money hidden in his forge to purchase expensive iron and steel. Meanwhile, Prudence had somehow acquired enough wealth to purchase additional medical instruments, improve her living quarters with new furniture and household items, and make generous donations to the church that established her reputation for Christian charity. She claimed to live solely on the voluntary contributions of grateful patients, but her lifestyle suggested access to resources that charitable donations alone could not explain. The investigators also uncovered disturbing details about Prudence's claimed background and credentials that called into question the entire story she had told about her life before arriving in Salem Village. Attempts to verify her claimed connections to Providence Plantation had yielded no results. No one there remembered a Prudence or Jeremiah Fairweather, and the religious leaders who had supposedly provided her letters of recommendation denied any knowledge of her existence. Her medical instruments, while impressive in their quality and completeness, were not the kind typically owned by frontier healers or midwives. Several were specialized surgical tools that would normally be found only in the practices of formally trained physicians in major cities like Boston or Philadelphia. The cost of such instruments would have been far beyond the means of most colonial settlers, raising questions about how she had acquired them and whether she was qualified to use them properly. During the harsh winter of 1693-1694, the disappearances temporarily ceased, leading some villagers to hope that whatever evil had plagued their community had finally passed. The brutal New England winter locked Salem Village in snow and ice for nearly 4 months, making travel beyond the immediate village center virtually impossible and forcing even the most determined predator to suspend hunting activities. This temporary respite allowed Prudence to consolidate her position within the community even further. She organized food distribution for struggling families, providing both supplies and organizational skills that helped the village survive one of the harshest winters in living memory. She led extended prayer sessions during the longest nights, offering spiritual comfort that helped maintain morale during the darkest months, when depression and despair typically claimed several lives. Her medical practice during the winter months was genuinely successful in ways that complicated efforts to expose her true nature. She assisted at 3 difficult births, saving both mothers and children who might otherwise have died without skilled intervention. She successfully treated several cases of respiratory illness that typically proved fatal during winter months, using herbal remedies and medical techniques that demonstrated genuine knowledge and skill. These successes made her seem increasingly indispensable to the community's survival and further reinforced her reputation as a devout Christian whose medical abilities were gifts from God. By spring, even some of her most suspicious critics found it difficult to maintain their doubts about her character in the face of tangible evidence that she had saved lives and eased suffering during the community's darkest hours. However, Martha Corey refused to allow these successes to diminish her growing conviction that Prudence was responsible for the disappearances. During the long winter evenings when travel was impossible and social visits were limited to immediate neighbors, Martha used the isolation to conduct more detailed interviews with the families of missing persons, gathering information that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of Prudence's true nature and methods. She learned that each victim had confided to family members about meeting with Prudence for what the healer called spiritual consultation, private sessions where she would help them address their moral failings and find peace with God. These consultations involved intensive prayer, fasting, and what Prudence described as purification rituals, based on obscure biblical passages that most villagers had never encountered in their regular religious education. The victims had emerged from these sessions speaking of achieving spiritual clarity and preparing for a special form of salvation that Prudence had promised them. Several had mentioned receiving a special blessing that would protect them from the devil's influence and prepare them for service to God in ways that ordinary Christians could never achieve. None could explain exactly what this blessing entailed, but they described feeling transformed by the experience in ways that made them eager to continue working with Prudence toward their spiritual goals. Most troubling of all, Martha discovered that Prudence had been systematically collecting personal information about each victim during these spiritual consultation sessions. She had asked detailed questions about their family relationships, daily routines, financial resources, and personal possessions, under the guise of understanding their spiritual needs and designing appropriate purification rituals. This information gathering served multiple purposes that became clear only when viewed in retrospect. It allowed Prudence to identify victims who were socially isolated and unlikely to be missed immediately. It provided her with the knowledge needed to forge convincing notes explaining their disappearances, and it helped her identify valuable possessions that could be taken without arousing immediate suspicion. The systematic nature of this information collection suggested planning and premeditation that went far beyond opportunistic crime. Prudence was operating as a methodical predator who used her position as a trusted healer and spiritual advisor to identify, isolate, and eliminate victims while maintaining her cover within the community she was systematically destroying. Spring's arrival in 1694 brought with it a renewed sense of hope among Salem Village's beleaguered residents, as melting snow revealed forest paths once again, and the community prepared for another growing season. However, this optimism was shattered when 2 more villagers vanished within a single devastating week, making it impossible for even the most determined skeptics to maintain their belief that the disappearances were random tragedies rather than systematic predation. Jacob Putnam, a struggling farmer of 28 who had been falling behind on his debts to more prosperous neighbors, disappeared on April 12th while walking to Salem town to seek employment as a day laborer. His financial difficulties had become a source of shame within the community, where economic failure was often interpreted as evidence of moral or spiritual weakness that had caused God to withdraw his blessings from the afflicted individual. Jacob had been seen leaving the village before dawn, carrying a small pack containing food and his few valuable possessions, intending to find work that would allow him to pay his debts and restore his family's standing in the community. When he failed to return by evening, his wife Hannah initially assumed he had found employment and would be staying in Salem town for several days to earn enough money to make the journey worthwhile. However, a messenger arriving from Salem town the following evening brought news that Jacob had never arrived at his intended destination. More disturbing still, his pack was found abandoned along the forest path, positioned carefully beside a distinctive rock formation that served as a landmark for travelers. Inside the pack, searchers found a note written in Jacob's handwriting, but expressing sentiments completely unlike his usual manner of thinking or speaking. The Lord has called me to serve His divine purpose in ways that transcend earthly obligations. The note read, I go now to join His chosen servants in a work of purification that will cleanse our community of sin and prepare it for the coming of His kingdom. Do not mourn my departure, for I have been granted the highest form of salvation. The theological language and concepts expressed in the note were far beyond Jacob's limited education and religious knowledge. Hannah insisted that her husband had never spoken of special salvation or purification work, and his primary concern had been finding practical solutions to their immediate financial problems, rather than pursuing abstract spiritual goals. Just 5 days later, on April 17th, Ruth Willard vanished under circumstances that followed the same disturbing pattern, but added new elements that suggested the predator was becoming bolder and more confident. Ruth was a spinster of 40 who lived alone and supported herself through spinning and weaving work that she sold to other villagers. She had been caught by Reverend Parris reading books other than the Bible, specifically a collection of English poetry that she had inherited from a deceased aunt. The discovery of secular literature in Ruth's possession had created a minor scandal within the strict Puritan community, where any reading material other than religious texts was viewed with deep suspicion as potentially corrupting to spiritual development. Ruth had been forced to undergo public confession and spiritual counseling to address what church leaders considered a serious moral failing that put her soul at risk. Ruth disappeared while walking to the home of a customer who had commissioned a set of bed linens, carrying with her the completed work and expecting to receive payment that would help her survive the upcoming winter. Her body was never found, but the bed linens she had been carrying were discovered folded neatly beside the forest path, arranged with the same careful precision that had characterized previous crime scenes. More disturbing than the arranged evidence was the discovery of a second note, this one supposedly written by Ruth, but expressing ideas and using language that were completely inconsistent with her known personality and beliefs. Like Jacob's note, it spoke of being called to serve God's purposes through purification work and achieving a special form of salvation that transcended normal Christian experience. Both victims had been seen entering Prudence Fairweather's house for spiritual consultation in the weeks before their disappearance, and both had spoken to acquaintances about working with the healer to address their moral failings and achieve spiritual purification. Their families later recalled conversations where the victims had mentioned receiving special guidance from Prudence about serving God in ways that ordinary Christians could never understand. The pattern was becoming so obvious that even the most reluctant villagers began to acknowledge the possibility that human agency rather than divine judgment was responsible for their community's ongoing tragedy. However, directly challenging Prudence seemed impossible given her established reputation and the community's desperate dependence on her medical services. Martha Corey, Giles Corey, and Sarah Bridgman formed a secret alliance to investigate further, meeting in hidden locations to share observations and plan their next moves. They discovered that Prudence had been asking each victim detailed questions about their personal belongings, family connections, and daily routines under the guise of spiritual counseling. During the summer of 1694, Timothy Corey, Martha's teenage nephew, volunteered to work as Prudence's assistant. His reports revealed disturbing details: strange odors from behind curtained areas, muffled sounds beneath the floorboards, and glimpses of a locked chest containing what appeared to be personal belongings of the missing villagers. When Timothy mentioned these observations to Prudence, her gentle demeanor vanished entirely. "There are aspects of God's work that mortal minds cannot comprehend," she hissed. "Those who question divine methods risk eternal damnation." The threat was clear enough that Timothy fled immediately. Armed with Timothy's testimony, the secret investigators faced an impossible dilemma. Prudence had become so integral to Salem Village's survival that challenging her directly would likely result in their own destruction. The community's memories of the witch trials made them deeply suspicious of anyone making accusations based on circumstantial evidence. Moreover, Prudence seemed to anticipate their growing suspicions with supernatural accuracy. She began incorporating warnings into her public prayers about false prophets who would attempt to discredit God's servants through lies and jealousy. 3 more villagers disappeared during this period. Benjamin Nurse, who had spoken critically of Prudence's influence; Abigail Foster, who had refused spiritual consultation; and most shockingly, Deacon Edward Putnam, one of the secret investigators himself. Edward's disappearance was particularly devastating because it eliminated their most credible voice and served as a clear warning to the remaining investigators. He vanished from his own home during the night, leaving behind a note claiming he had been called to join God's chosen servants in purification work. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Salem Village intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Prudence's behavior became increasingly bold following Edward's disappearance. She conducted group purification rituals that lasted entire nights, with participants emerging in states of religious ecstasy. However, Martha noticed that several attendees subsequently disappeared within weeks, following the same pattern that had claimed individual victims. The breakthrough came on a freezing December night in 1696, when Giles Corey witnessed something that shattered every assumption about human nature. Unable to sleep, he had taken to walking the village streets during the darkest hours before dawn. On this night, he observed a faint light flickering behind Prudence's curtained windows. Through a gap in the wooden shutters, Giles saw Prudence standing in a circle of candles, methodically cutting strips of flesh from a human body on her medical table. Her movements were practiced and efficient, more like a butcher than a healer. Most horrifying, she hummed hymns while working, her ice-blue eyes reflecting candlelight with inhuman intensity. Prudence wrapped portions of flesh in white cloth, handling them with gentle care before placing them in her locked chest, along with clothing and jewelry. The systematic nature of her actions revealed this was not her first such procedure. Giles retreated undetected, but the knowledge felt like poison in his mind. The woman they had trusted as a servant of God was actually a predator who had been systematically hunting their community members, using their faith against them with devastating effectiveness. When Martha and Sarah learned of Giles's discovery, they realized they possessed proof that could save lives but no safe way to expose it. Their dilemma intensified when Prudence began showing unusual interest in Martha herself, approaching her with insistent offers of spiritual consultation. "Sister Martha," Prudence said, her pale eyes fixed intently, "I perceive spiritual turmoil that threatens your soul's salvation. The Lord has placed it upon my heart to offer you special prayers for cleansing." Martha's refusal only seemed to increase Prudence's determination. She began appearing at the Corey farm at unusual hours, always with plausible excuses, but clearly testing for weaknesses and opportunities. The situation reached its breaking point when Sarah Bridgman vanished, after agreeing to meet with Prudence for what she believed would be final answers about her son Thomas's fate. Her disappearance was the catalyst that drove Martha and Giles to take desperate action. During a severe February blizzard that trapped everyone indoors, Martha and Giles broke into Prudence's house while she attended a birth at the Willard farm. What they discovered beneath the floorboards exceeded their worst fears. 17 bodies in various stages of decomposition, arranged in shallow graves with identical marks, precise throat cuts, bound hands, and strange symbols carved into foreheads. The systematic arrangement suggested ongoing ritualistic purposes, with evidence that some victims had been kept alive for extended periods before death. Prudence's locked chest contained an inventory of trophies, labeled locks of hair, blood-stained clothing, and detailed notes describing each victim's final moments with clinical satisfaction. One entry described Sarah Bridgman's recent death. The Bridgman woman proved remarkably resilient, maintaining consciousness for nearly 6 hours during purification. Her final words were pleas about her son, never realizing he had achieved salvation through my ministry months ago. Armed with irrefutable evidence, Martha and Giles contacted Colonial authorities in Salem town. Prudence was arrested on February 18, 1697, while conducting a prayer circle. Her reaction revealed the cold calculation behind her actions. No remorse, no surprise, only bitter satisfaction. "Every soul I claimed was polluted with sin," she stated calmly during interrogation. "I offered them purification through suffering, just as Christ achieved redemption through pain. Their deaths were acts of mercy, cleansing corruption that would have damned them eternally." Her trial became notorious throughout Colonial Massachusetts, built on physical evidence rather than spectral accusations. Prudence was executed by hanging on March 15, 1697, refusing opportunities to repent. Her final words chilled the crowd. "The work of purification will continue. There are others who understand the necessity of cleansing corruption from God's chosen people." The house was burned immediately after execution, but psychological wounds took much longer to heal. The community had been forced to confront how evil could disguise itself as righteousness, using their faith and desperation against them. Official records were sealed by authorities fearing copycat killers or renewed hysteria. For 3 centuries, Prudence Fairweather's name was deliberately omitted from historical accounts, contributing to collective amnesia about horrors that should have been remembered as warnings. This mystery shows us that the greatest evil often wears virtue's mask, using our noblest impulses with calculated precision. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about Prudence Fairweather's true motives? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.